I made a video a while back about this pond behind me and its construction. It took 3 days and 55 litres of diesel in a 2-ton digger. And I kept careful track of the amount of diesel we went through because I want to keep track of the inputs to the establishment of the system. And I've had a few debates about the appropriateness of using equipment in systems like this. I've been told that it's a disaster. I've been told it's a huge mistake, which, I'm always open to debate. I'm always interested in, having differing opinions. But I've thought a lot about this, and it's something I really can't agree with. So, using this as an example, this very small farm pond, using this as an example, I'm going to hope to put that theory, that approach, completely to bed, and how it really isn't valid in the establishment of systems. So, if I wasn't going to use a digger, what would be my options? Well, really the only option is to hand dig. Now, hand digging is possible for certain things. I recently put in a swale by hand, about 50 metres long. Took a few days, it wasn't difficult work. But I've previously done swales with a digger, which is a lot faster, of course, but not quite as neat. There are some advantages doing things by hand. But in the case of something even relatively small, like a pond like that, because there's a compacted subsoil clay berm that the machine itself drags along, compacts, and makes watertight as you layer it up. I've got a video on it. You can't really do that by hand, but because the clay content here is so high, theoretically possible, I suppose. If you had a huge number of people with sledgehammers that were packing it as other people were layering it on, you probably could make a pretty decent watertight pond. But the man hours would be extraordinary, it'd take a lot. So I'll put some numbers together. Now, I reckon when you're digging in subsoil, now there's working with a digger and there's working with a digger. In the event of just flipping topsoil like I was with the swale, it's not that much faster. It's a lot faster, but we're talking relatively little because you're just moving material within a spade's width. You're not moving it further away, you're not barrowing it and so on. That really slows things down. So something I could do in half an hour with a digger would be a couple of days with a spade. It's not a massive change there. If you're talking about moving materials 10-15 feet, it's a huge amount, because you can do that in a single boom with the digger, so it's very fast at it, compared to putting it into a barrow, moving it over, dumping it, and sometimes having to shovel it out as well. So that's incredibly time consuming. If you're talking about moving a huge mound of soil and moving it 10-15 feet, just dragging it with the digger, incredibly fast, so much faster. Again, days and days and days of backbreaking work condensed into minutes. But the majority, there was a certain amount of that involved in this pond, but the majority of it was just digging into compacted subsoil, the actual clay with rocks in it, and some of those are so big that you'd really struggle to move them by hand. You'd need to split them, which is a whole job in and of itself. But it's backbreaking work. The soil here is compacted subsoil. It's solid stuff, and there's massive solid clay with boulders in it. So as you're pickaxing away at it, you hit the boulders and it's jarring. It really takes it out on your joints. It's incredibly hard. You can only do it for so long. And you're not just digging it, then you're shifting it with a wheelbarrow up a berm and around. So you're not just moving it 10 feet. You've got to go all the way around because you've got a steep berm, dump it, and then compact it. It's compared to just dig, dump. Even if you're scraping a little bit with a digger to get a scoop load and then dumping it, it's still much, much quicker. So I reckon that using that 55 litres of diesel, I did 20 hours of work in about 5 minutes, and that's on digging the subsoil, and that works out at about 240 times faster using a digger. Now, that's a very rough number, but I've done a bit of searching around as well, and I've come up with figures generally around the 300 mark. In what a digger makes you 300 times more efficient, and that's a fairly large digger. I'm using a relatively small one, so I'd say 240 is about accurate. When I first started coming up with these numbers, I wasn't particularly comfortable with the numbers. I am now, having done a bit more research. So if it took me 36 hours to dig that with the digger, which it did, roughly, and it's 240 times bigger, that works out as 8,640 person hours to do that pond, even assuming it was possible. But, you know, we're going to accept that it is. For me, working on my own, working a 38-hour week, that would work out at 227 weeks. That's impossible. It's never going to happen. No one can spend years working all day, every day, just to dig a fairly small pond. Because winter would come in, undo most of your work. The berm wouldn't be constructed in a single season, which it needs to be. Otherwise, you're pumping it out all winter and causing problems. It's just not an option. So it'd need doing in a relatively small space of time. A small amount of time, rather. Now, here, in the context of, you know, putting in permaculture systems, that usually means voluntary labour. So, okay, if we wanted to get it done in 14 days, say, working 8 hours a day, which, you know, basically means people putting in 10, 11-hour days, but some you'll have with breaks and meal times and so on. If you're working for 8 hours, you're at least 10 hours at work, so pretty long days. Works out at, for 14 days, works out 112 hours per person. So I would need 77 people here for 2 weeks, working all day, every day, to get that pond constructed. Now, it actually wouldn't be 77, because we'd have to deal with that number of people. You can't have people breaking off to cook their own meals, or it would take even longer. So you'd have to have at least 2 people as cooking staff. You'd need to have at least a couple of people on clean up, wash up, and so on. I think these things are generally done on rotation, some of the more supporting roles, but still, we're talking upwards of 80 people. Because for all them people, for 2 weeks here, 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, you know, very high calorie diet with people doing physical work, even if they are young, plus drinks, plus washing up. We're talking 3,240 meals. That's without allowing for, you know, support roles like, you know, cooking staff, washing up staff, and so on. Plus, with that number of people, there's a lot of drama, you know. That's a small village, you know, it's a significant number of people. There's going to be, the human element. It's just inevitable with that number of people in a small place for a concentrated period of time. So, we live very far north. We're just south of John O'Groats, so it's about as far north as you can get in mainland Britain. If we were to transport those people here, right, people would come from far and wide if we had to do the voluntary thing, because they'd have to. We're not going to get a large group of people from one place. People are going to be dispersed. The nearest large town for us is Inverness, which is 100 miles away. To get that many people here, right, I did the numbers, 40 to 50 people on a conventional bus. A bus that's 6 to 9 miles per gallon for 100 miles. That is 50 litres of diesel per bus that seats 40 to 50 people, and we need 2 of them, just from Inverness, just from the nearest town, to get those people here. Plus all the diesel involved in moving all the food, or, you know, colossal. And of course there's the cooking fuel and all the rest of it. We're already into many times more diesel just for the people to be here to do it than it cost me to just have a digger here for 3 days and bang the pond out quick on my own and get it done in 1 year. I mean, it's not narrow, it's significant. And don't forget that this is only using 240 times the size, you know, the efficiency. You know, if we're talking with a number that's 300, it gets even bigger. Looking at it in the diesel argument in terms of fossil fuel, it just doesn't add up. It is far more efficient, even in terms of fossil fuel and carbon output and so on. It's far more efficient environmentally, financially, in every way, using these small digging equipment for manufacturing infrastructure like this that's going to last indefinitely, I think is about as sensible a use of fossil fuel as we can use. It's the surgical, strategic use of diesel to permanently change the landscape, to make it more resilient, to increase personal resiliency and community resiliency. We're going to need a lot more systems like this before we're done, and we can't do them all by hand. It's just not going to work. Huge projects were done in the past, like the paddy fields in Asia, for example, by hand, but they were mostly done with pretty exploited people under basically slave labour conditions. That isn't something we should be aspiring to. We should be building these systems now while we still have the fossil fuels available, because if we don't use them for this, they're going to be used for transporting water up and down the motorways between different regions. You can buy Welsh water in Scotland, you can buy Highland water in Wales. It's crazy. And that's what the diesel is currently being used for. We've got packaging that is typically 50% bigger than it needs to be. So we've got The lorries are driving around full of empty packaging that has its own environmental impact as well, of course, but we're using the diesel to drive around fresh air, and yet we're criticising people for using that diesel strategically in systems like this. Now, I know people that do acres of arable. They come in and using scythes by hand, they harvest acres of grain. That's awesome. It's brilliant. I mean, very inspiring systems, and we need systems like that. But the equivalent to that would be using a combine harvester, and that's something that needs doing every single year. This isn't something that needs doing every single year. This is something that needs doing once. It's a one-off input of fossil fuel energy rather than the ongoing continuous use of fossil fuel energy that just soaks into every part of our lives. Supermarket food is covered in fossil fuel energy. It's got a massive fossil fuel input, and that's just transporting the stuff, never mind the growing of it. The argument that fossil fuels are entirely bad is a classic example of just black and white thinking. It's nice, it's simple, it's easy because you can grasp on it. This is good, this is bad. The reality is things aren't very often that simple. They're not that black and white, if you will. The gas boiler that we use here for the customer showers, you see I'm sitting on one of the pods, customer showers are just over there. It's a gas boiler. That is the most environmentally sustainable solution for us currently. Eventually we're going to switch over to something that runs on biomass. That'll be willow that we grow ourselves on site. But if we were to buy in that biomass, and there might be a little bit of overlap there, but if we were to buy in that biomass now, the logs that we'd be using to run it would have been shipped in as green wood, so we're importing really heavy water, and then there would have been kiln dried locally using fossil fuel energy. It's far more efficient to just use that fossil fuel energy to directly heat the water, like we're doing here, as an interim measure, than it would be to go the other route. Even though, strictly speaking, that's carbon negative because it's logs. It's just not that simple. So those are my thoughts on the use of fossil fuel inputs in the establishment of permaculture systems. Using the diesel that I have here on site is the equivalent of one local bus running for about 2 hours. It's a tiny amount of diesel. It sounds a lot because it's a personal use of diesel, but really it's a tiny amount of diesel in the grand scheme of things. So I'm entirely comfortable with that. Now everyone has to make their own decision on this, but the argument that we shouldn't be using it for this, I think, is entirely invalid. I welcome debate on this subject. I'm always open to fresh ideas, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about this in recent weeks, and I've come to the conclusion that no, I am entirely comfortable with the ongoing use of fossil fuels in the establishment of systems, not the maintenance of them. Our eventual aim here is to be as closed loop as we possibly can, in terms of everything from animal feed to, well, all the animal systems are designed, doesn't mean we'll necessarily arrive there perfectly, but they're designed as an attempt to create a closed loop system that requires no external feed. Similarly, the same goes for pretty much the customer side of the business, like the pod I'm sitting on here. Should be virtually input free within several years, and the same goes for the orchard systems. Now, given that the rest of our croft and our business and mostly our house will be running entirely on-site resources, and this is on a 5-acre plot. It's a lot of land to my view, but really, compared to most farmland, it's tiny. I think that given the fact that in the ongoing use we will be using virtually no inputs compared to just about every other system I've ever come across, conventional or permaculture, I'm comfortable with the one-off use of those fossil fuels. Yeah, that's my thoughts on it.